Hello and welcome to Live from America podcast. This is Hatem. Unfortunately, Noam had a emergency again. He couldn't make it this time. But Boris Khaykin, my good friend and comedian, is here. Hello, Boris.
Hello, hello.
After a great show at the Williams Center on Saturday we had together, he was amazing. He killed it. And our guest of honor, someone I've been looking forward to have for a long time, John Tierney, contributor editor for to City Journal, former New York Times columnist, and bestseller for two great books. I think everybody should definitely read. Uh, the bestseller Willpower, Rediscovering the Greatest Human Strength and the Power of Bad, How the Negativity Effect Rules Us and How We Can Rule It. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Hatem. I'm really glad to be here.
And I really appreciate that you said my name right. Nobody can ever get my name right. So I really appreciate that. So, this, as I said, like I think it's one of the most important episodes that I've done. I like people to, I think this is going to be a gift for the listeners because you can learn a lot from the conversation today. And it hits a lot of personal level for me, which I'll explain later. But you ever hear like, I have some really good news and some really bad news. Which one you want to hear first? And everybody says, let me hear the bad news.
Yeah.
Why is that? John is going to explain that to us. Why is that? Why is the power of bad is so strong?
Well, it's called the negativity effect. And basically, our brains are wired that we just pay more attention to bad stuff than good stuff. And there's a reason it evolved, from an evolutionary standpoint, because it was more important to, pay attention to threats. And, rather than savoring the delicious berries, you wanted to know which ones were poisonous and pay attention to that. But the problem today is that we just have this whole industry, a crisis industry that I call them the merchants of bad, the media, academics, bureaucrats, politicians who just exploit that all the time. And so that, and it's gotten worse with with the internet because people want clicks. The easiest way to get clicks is to, the easiest way to get immediate clicks is with fear. Over the long term, being positive actually has some benefits because people, but the easiest way to get immediate attention is just to scare people.
And this connects with everything in life, not just like, bad news and good news. It's like the election, for example, recently, both campaign ran on fear. If you vote for the other person, this could happen. Religion, a lot of like I'm a believer, but I'm saying a lot of religious people will try to say, hey, hell versus heaven, and instead of like the virtue of good of religion. Like it's all about scaring stuff.
Right. Well, in The Power of Bad, we have a chapter on religion. And the interesting thing is when you look at religion and the history of the United States is interesting because the religions that emphasize hell are the ones that grow. And what happens, you go back to the Anglican, the Episcopalians and the Congregationalists, as their clergy got more educated in seminaries and they began downplaying hell and they started, let's not scare people so much. Then, you had the Great Awakening and you had Methodists and Baptists who preached hell, and they became the dominant religions. And then they started, softening the message. And then along came Catholics and, evangelicals. And so hell, that's the way you fill the pews on Sunday.
Do you think there's like an immunity that you get eventually? Because it's almost there's this contradiction when you insert technology into it. Like with the election, right? I
Right.
don't personally get super emotional about it, and that's because I have a lot of friends in New York who tell me that it's going to be, fascism if Trump gets in. But then I have a lot of friends in Jersey who tell me it's going to be communism and if Kamala gets in. And so eventually it's similar with religions. I'd imagine if all you're exposed to is Christianity and you have a fear of hell, but then you kind of learn about other religions that might have their own damnation or judgment if you don't believe in their system. And you're like, well, I'm kind of damned either way. And it sort of reduces the blow of either one if you sort of look at it from an information standpoint. Do you think in terms of like with all these clicks and everything that thrives on negativity, that there's a natural immunity that'll come with time, both as we technologically solve for it, but also like psychologically, that we can only get inundated with like negativity so much before it sort of loses the amount of impact it has on us?
Well, that's a great point. And the way you talk about it, I mean, it's kind of a struggle between the primitive parts of the brain, which are what really respond to fear, and then the frontal cortex, the rational part of it. If you take a big look at it, the way you're talking about with religion, then you can start to overcome that. You have to fight it, and I mean, one solution. I mean, I call it the crisis. We're this constant, threat of crisis all the time. We're getting the news media, and one way to counteract it is just to look at long-term trends. And if you look at over the long haul, you can see that virtually everything's getting better. But instead of focusing on, oh, there's this one bad thing happening today, or one bad thing happened to one person, and that's going to dominate the news. But on the whole, things are getting better. So you have to use that rational side of you to overcome that primal instinct to be afraid of things. And I think, I mean, there's always going to be there's so many more incentives, in this crisis industry for people to stoke that. And as you get, I mean, as you say, psychologically, we might start to become immune to one kind of thing, but they're going to look for something else. I mean, they're going to look for fresh. There's always, I mean, yeah. I mean, I've spent most of my career at the New York Times and magazines and at City Journal debunking crises. But what you find is that the crisis mongers, as soon as one fizzles out, remember in the 70s, there was a population crisis in the 60s and 70s. We're all going to starve to death because we wouldn't have enough food. And then turns out, well, actually, we have more food than ever. So then there was the energy crisis that we're going to run out of, energy. And of course, then that came to, then it was global warming. And then it's, so there's always a new crisis, that they'll come up with to try and prod that part of the brain.
And the other thing is like to Boris' point, but first of all, Boris, I cannot be serious with how big your coffee mug is.
The rest are in the wash. I ran. I didn't want to be
one more
late.
time because I try to make like what the okay, it's bigger than you. But one thing that I want to make, and that point not only to religion but also to politics. But if we stick with religion, I think to be immune to something, I believe religion is a beautiful thing, and there's a lot of things to it. One of the negative thing of hearing too much negativity and bad is you become immune. So it's like, you know what, both sides are bad, so I'm just not gonna believe in anything, and you end up losing something very meaningful. You know what I'm saying?
There's also, sorry, to your point, I was just going to add that, like, personally, I'm not a believer, right? But I think I used to be.
I guess we'll figure that.
Well, I used to be sort of more militantly atheist when I was younger, and I think moving to New York and seeing how a lot of the people that had similar belief systems to me seemed to either end up in like a nihilist or like depressive state where they end up, at best just being on like SSRIs or something, or at worst they end up treating other things as a religious belief system, whether it's liberalism or whether it's whatever else. Something else fills the void. And so, like you're saying, a crisis gets replaced with another crisis. You could be a person that's aware and skeptical to a particular crisis or a particular religion, and you almost get caught off guard because you think you're immune to it, where you end up having.
No, but I'm also saying that you become immune to it, so you'll become immune to the good, not only to the bad. You know what I'm saying? So you become immune to the whole thing. And instead of, I think it's my goal, I think what I like to do is like, instead of becoming immune to thing, is to look, and I think maybe that's John, I want to ask him about that. That's your point, is to look at the good at that situation, not just avoid the whole situation. Am I right, John? Or
No, absolutely. I mean, you're both right. It's a great point that when people just give up on religion, I mean, I was raised Catholic. I'm a totally lapsed Catholic. I guess I'd call myself an agnostic or an atheist. But the older I get, I'm exactly like Boris. I have more and more respect for traditional religion because you see, it just, our religious people are happier. They're more content with life. And they also, there's so much social good from this community of religion. And as Boris says, when people abandon that, the stuff they replace it with, because there is this thing in the brain. I mean, that there's a religion, there's a need for transcendent meaning that people have. And if they don't find it in religion, they start looking for it in other ways. And the worst thing is, I mean, I think the religions they turn to, like environmentalism, it just becomes a cult, where sort of a doomsday cult. And the worst thing is when people use politics as a religion, because
Yeah.
politics is just, there's no forgiveness in politics. It just lacks the good parts of religion, and it's us against them, and they're evil, and we're going to defeat them. And it really, cancel culture and all this stuff is so, it's just a terror. People use terrible substitutes for religion.
Yeah, we're gonna focus a little bit on politics in the next few, but for people that want to know what exactly is the negativity effect, how does it shape everything in our that we do? Like what is the definition of that? Like how do you recognize what is negativity effect and something?
Well, the negativity effect was discovered by my co-author, Roy Baumeister, who's a great social psychologist. And he had noticed, back, economists, Danny Kahneman won the Nobel Prize, the behavioral economists, they noticed that people cared a lot more about losing money than making money, and that losing $100 was much more important than making 100. And social psychologists had noticed that there's, that like it's easy to acquire a bad reputation, very hard to get rid of it, whereas it takes a long time to get a good one. So Roy, he really is this great kind of big thinker. He started wondering, well, when is bad stronger than good, and when is good stronger than bad? And he goes, so let's look at, through all the literature in psychology, economics, philosophy, everything, sociology. And they looked around hoping to find examples of where good was stronger, and they couldn't, like bad. And the name of it was a landmark paper called Bad is Stronger Than Good. And it's just, and you see it over and over again that, good parenting doesn't really make much difference, but bad parenting makes a difference. I mean, as long as you're not really traumatizing your kids, they're going to do fine, but it's the bad stuff that matters. It's there's a thing called, and you see why this evolved, that in a clan in an ancient hunter-gatherer clan, it was, if there were one bad person could doom the clan, so you had to pay really attention to bad people, and the good, your friends you didn't. It was really important that you to pay attention to your enemies.
You're absolutely right. It's like when we said, like, do you want to hear good news or bad news? It's also if you like, hey, John, by the way, I really like the way you do this. I like this, that. The only thing is I don't like when you do that. The only thing sticks with you is that, you remember,
Exactly.
you know, uh, I coach soccer and a lot of times like I'd give instruction and million of good things and one bad thing, and that sticks in their mind the whole time.
They
But
say to do the sandwich method for feedback, right? You're supposed to start with a positive, sandwich the criticism in between there, and then end
Yeah,
again.
yeah, the sandwich thing. Although I'm in the power bad, we talked about that, Boris, actually, and it doesn't really work, the classic way, because when you start off with the good stuff, they're not really listening. They're just waiting for the bad stuff.
yeah, yeah.
And so people tend to, like, they'll start with, oh, you've done this and this and this, and then you talk about the bad stuff, and then you wrap it up quickly. Thing is, they're not hearing the good stuff. They're just waiting for the bad. And then after they hear the bad, that's when their brain is on high alert. So what you want to do, I mean, our advice is start by like saying, okay, we're not going to fire you. Don't worry about that. But then immediately get into the bad stuff. And then you got to follow that up with lots of good stuff. And we have a thing in the book that we call the rule of four, that if you look, there's a lot of research where, for instance, psychologists have had people keep track of their days. Is it a good day or a bad day? And they find that in general, it takes about at least 3 good days to make up for a bad day. And it takes, 3 good compliments to make up for a bad. So we said, try and do at least 4 to be safe. So we call, have 4 to 1. And that's what you really need to do, that if you, if you're late once, you don't make up for it by being on time the next time. You got to do it 4 times. And it's just a rough guideline, but it's exactly that you have to really, bad is stronger, but good prevails in the long run because there's a lot more of it. But it
You
just
know,
takes a while.
when you hear like when there's a movie, you're watching a movie, you're waiting for the plot, which is something bad is gonna happen. And that's what I was gonna, when you hear a song, everything was okay until you know that something's coming. But I tell you even more, I think, because I'm very involved in sports, I think sports is based on bad is stronger than good. Because about how many times you lose over and over and over, and then until you win, you know? And it's always about you remember a loss, whatever your team is, and it just hurts so much more than the joy of a win that can last a day or two, you know? So everything is pretty much is I know in your book or I saw in the interview you always you also say like even sex, like great sex can be great, but bad sex is it's over.
Yeah. Well, there's no, one thing Roy noticed was there is no, most good things and bad things, they have opposites, that you're depressed or you're happy, but there is no word that means the opposite of trauma. There's no one event that like, that will make you, that'll stick with you for life and make you happy forever. So, there's never one, sexual encounter that you'll never, that you'll just keep reliving, whereas a bad one can do that.
What
And
about like an ayahuasca trip? Can ayahuasca be the reverse
well,
trauma?
it can be good then, but I don't, it's not gonna, it's not as much as like one horrible thing. And getting back to sports, I mean, that's a great example. One thing I remember playing Little League, but I lived in South America as a kid and played soccer and liked it. And I came back and played Little League baseball here. And I just thought you mostly stand around, which wasn't as much fun. And they keep track of your mistakes.
Yep.
It's like, they just hear how many errors did you make? But the one thing about, and again, speaking about sports, is the power bat is useful in a way because you learn so much more from mistakes than you do from good things. You
But you
know,
have to have a certain personality.
well,
She's an
but
athlete. What an
everybody does
athlete.
learn more. I mean, one of the real problems in school, and especially a problem for boys, is that they've stopped grading and class ranking stuff, and so people don't learn from their mistakes. Boys like that competition, um, and getting negative feedback really helps you, improve. And if you don't do that anymore, getting away from penalties and everybody gets a trophy, people don't learn from their mistakes that way.
That's a great point, and I want to like touch on it a little bit more. I wasn't planning to, but I think, nobody have the courage to say that anymore. But it's very true in sports. A lot of time, even when you give kids like eighth place trophy, they already
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and a lot of times I tell, players is like, don't accept your role. Don't accept that you're just a role player. Don't accept that you're second or third in the team. It's not how it is. You have to fight. You have to continue going. But yeah, sports is about, I always say sports is like, it's two teams that make mistakes. The one that make less mistakes is the one that wins.
Right.
That's pretty much it. But you have to have that personality. Is like, so you think from your studies and your background that, given a negative feedback is very helpful in sports, and also not everybody wins. Like you have to lose at some point to know.
Exactly. I mean, that's when you really learn. Because when you get 100 on a test, then you don't really learn anything. But when it's the things you got wrong that are really ingrained in you. I mean, I play bridge, for instance, and when you make a mistake in bridge, you just don't make. You go, I'll never do that again.
Yeah.
Because that was so stupid. How could I have done that? And that's how you really learn it. So.
So let's talk about politics and voting. Like now, voting, in my opinion, has become you vote against somebody, not for someone. Maybe the last couple of candidates or the like last
Yeah.
election, you vote for Biden because you don't want Trump, or you vote for Trump because you want Kamala, or vice versa. So the power of bad, like we're saying before in the campaigns, is like, oh, if you get Kamala, is gonna be the border is gonna be open, cancel culture. If you get Trump, this instead of focusing on what they really can do, what's the policies that they can do. Is that a so for a while I thought before, I start researching you and your books and all that, I thought that this is just something they came up with, but this is actually a plan. The power of bad is strong even in politics.
Oh, absolutely. I covered a couple of presidential campaigns, for the New York Times, but the '92 campaign with Clinton and the 2004 campaign. And in fact, in the first one, I was kind of the media critic, so I would review the debates and I'd watch all that. At that time, you had to sit in a hotel room and watch it on your VCR, the political ads. You'd be recording them and things. And the one thing that, every candidate starts out saying, I'm going to offer a positive vision for America. But what everybody knew was they were going to go negative because I mean, everybody knew that it was the negative ads that really had an impact. And so they would inevitably turn negative pretty quickly, and especially once they were in trouble at all, then you start attacking. I mean, like the most effective ad this last campaign was probably that one that Trump did about
Transgender.
Was for they, them.
yeah, the they, them, and you, and that was a
Yeah.
straight attack thing, and it's often been that way. The most effective one is a negative ad, because that sticks with you. So, I mean, it's always been the way. I think it's gotten worse because, things have gotten so tribal on the web, and people, I mean, the legacy media, and I mean, I've been astonished at what's happened to the legacy media. It's gotten so partisan. When I was there, I mean, I'm a libertarian. Most of the other reporters were all Democrats, but there was this sort of sense that you had to try to be responsible. Newspapers still wanted to get advertising from Republicans. They wanted to have Republican readers. And now the business model has shifted where you're basically, you're relying on subscription revenue. And so you want subscribers. So you basically want to go for one side or the other and tell them what they want to hear. And then on the web, people, on extra things, it's easy to get into that thing where you're only hearing from people on your side. And all you're hearing is the absolute worst thing that they can think about Kamala Harris or the worst thing about Donald Trump. And that's what you just get bombarded with all the time.
Is that bound to burst, though, given this previous election, especially how it seems that sort of what happened was there was kind of an ecosystem that metastasized on the left, whereas on the right, they created, I mean, what could inarguably be called a broad coalition if you look at like RFK and Trump and,
Yeah,
Tulsi and you can lump them in and judge them based on, whatever pejoratives you have for them. But it's hard to say that they're all aligned when it comes to policy. They're obviously not. RFK is, pretty left leaning in terms of like government intervention and private
right.
business and things like that.
Yeah. Um, well, I think the Democrats just got hijacked by these special interest groups, and they couldn't, and so they really couldn't disavow all these unpopular positions. And the one good trend that that if you look at polls of the public over the last few decades, people haven't really shifted their attitudes. The general population has not shifted its attitudes. The population is generally a little bit center right. And people's attitudes on basic issues haven't changed. What's changed are the chattering classes have gotten, they're the ones who are really extreme on both sides. And they really came to dominate the Democratic Party. And it really hurt them this election, I think. The Republicans did just part of what unified them was just being against all this crazy stuff on the left, and against big government. So I think that unified them, and as you say, it brought together lots of these diverse people who just, they're very contradictory messages, some of them, but they were able to agree on a few things. We don't want an open border, we don't love this woke culture. I mean, the woke has always been like 10 or 15% of the population at most, but it came so to dominate institutions. And I think people just felt, I'm tired of it. I can't watch a movie. I can't go to a museum. I can't do anything without getting a woke lecture. And I'm tired of it. I think that, that's what some of it was about.
And I think also like with the fear of both campaigns, people kind of like that. It's entertaining. Like you said, like the legacy media, like now when you see like breaking news, you don't expect somebody won something,
Yeah.
I was like, oh shit, yeah,
Yeah.
breaking news. Yeah, let's see what's going on. But I think, both campaign played it right, but I think the Republican played it to real fear that people can feel it
Yeah.
rather than the Democrat um, played on the fear of imagination. And they've been lying the last few years that people cannot imagine. Oh, is it really going to be that bad? Isn't while the walk and stuff that Republican ran on, was specific on something that you can relate to in a day-to-day basis. But I don't think it's going anywhere. I think the people are going to continue fear. You already have it, just the fear continues to be in a different location. Now you're going to go move to Iran or you're going to move to whatever,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
how it's going to be. But the fear is always going to be there. But the
It,
media has become like you said, like they want subscription. The media has become, it became entertainment. It's like you turn on CNN or MSNBC if you want to hear something, or Fox if you want to hear something else. It becomes entertainment. And people now try to go on like the show's podcast or something that's not,
But there
uh,
are repercussions sort of outside of their subscriber base, right? Like there was to relate to our next topic, there was recently going around clips of this article they did on RFK. And I'm, no fan of RFK. I think, he's got stuff that I would say is correct and he's got stuff that I would say is loony. But they picked this thing that went viral in a screenshot where they basically criticized his criticism of Fruit Loops and the different marketing in America versus Canada. And he pointed out that, they have different ingredients. And then the article is basically like, but the ingredients are basically the same. The only difference is these natural food colorings versus this food dye and this food dye and this food dye and this processing chemical that's added for fresh. It's like self-parody, basically. And they're adding credibility to RFK by criticizing him. It's like criticizing Hitler because you think hyperinflation is good. Like they're adding credibility. It's the Trump treatment.
yeah, that's
They're not
what they did with
able.
Trump. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not even that they're not able to pick their battles, but they can't even pick the things that are battles and the things that are not bad.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what undermined their credibility was so much that people just started to say, if they're saying that about RFK or Trump, I know in the past they've said crazy things, that he's a fascist, that he's this, that, he was president for 4 years and fascism didn't come. And so when you hear this, you just start to discount them. And I mean, I think one sort of good trend this election was the legacy media became so much less important, that people. And one nice thing was about, for podcasters that, one thing when I was writing for the Times and I had to review all the presidential debates, this was in '92, and I had to like watch it and write an instant review for the next day's paper. And one of the things I just complained about was that debates are such an artificial format, that's ask this question, you get 90 seconds and, people are doing this. And I said, and the best one I saw that year was I remember it was McNeil Lair had the two candidates sit down and they just sort of talk to each other. And I always said that's what they should really do is just sit down and have a conversation so you could really see what they're like and they instead of just doing their little sound bites. And that's the great thing about podcasts, and I think Trump did so well on them that, when he sat down with Joe Rogan, that you could see, people knew he's not this fascist monster. He actually, he may say some weird things at times, but he seems like a normal person in some ways. So you see a whole different side, and that counters the power of bad.
So when we talk about, the war in science, Boris, were you a guest also when I interviewed Dr. Gupta?
I don't think so. No,
Okay.
I would
So
remember.
the war in science when COVID came in and all that. And what do you think about, you covered a lot of stuff like that. And now you see RFK and you see all the picks, which we'll have an episode about soon. I think next week we'll have about Trump picks, which is very interesting. It's almost he wants to drive people crazy. Um, and he was like maybe taking the woke movement too much. I don't know what he's trying to do, honestly, but uh let's be more specific with RFK and his picks in general. First of all, let me ask you this: who's the one pick that turned your head around when you heard his or her name?
Well, I guess Matt Gaetz was a bizarre one. It looks like he's not going to be confirmed, So,
Yeah,
and RFK surprised me, but and like Boris, I think he's got some really, kind of off the wall beliefs. But what's really interesting about him is that he really knows these bureaucracies, and he comes into it. Like previous, guys who've run, the HHS, the Health and Human Services they're like lawyers or they come there somewhere. But he has been, he wrote this book about the real Anthony Fauci. And a friend of mine who's, very serious data journalist, read it and really did his own research and said, I mean, he says some things in there that are dubious, he doesn't back up, but so much of it is he really has exposed the corruption of the public health bureaucracy. And I mean, I did a piece a few years ago about the corruption of public health and saying how it had just been taken over. The science had been set aside and had been taken over by progressives. And it was, and the whole point of it became, how can we get more government regulation? How can we do more, and advance all these progressive goals? And science but so I was a complete skeptic of the thing, and I'm really and hoping somebody does blow it up. So that's um, but um, but even I was amazed at what happened during COVID. I mean, the plan before COVID by the best people who study it was you don't lock down, you don't mandate masks, you don't close schools. You want to protect the vulnerable people and you want life to go on, as normally as possible. There was this landmark paper in 2006 by this guy, Donald Hendrickson, who led the worldwide effort to eradicate smallpox. And he looked at all the evidence about masks and lockdowns and things. And he just said there's no evidence that they work and they cause enormous, enormous social damage and economic damage. And those were the official plans of the CDC and the EU and the UK. And then it came along and suddenly, oh, China said the lockdown works, so let's do it. And it was just incredible to see everyone adopt these measures for which there was no backing. And they said, oh, well, we think it's going to work this time. And then, the evidence that came out during the pandemic all showed that the lockdowns were, unnecessary, that they were, they didn't accomplish anything. The country that really did best in Europe was Sweden. They never locked down, never closed down the schools. They tried to protect the older people. And it was just unbelievable to me that the whole
Yeah.
establishment, went down. So clearly, I think it really showed part of the problem was that, Fauci, he controlled so much research funding. He controlled the spigot for all this research funding in infectious diseases. And so people were afraid to argue with them because they're going to lose their grants. And one of the proposals that people have made that I hope RFK will institute, there it's been reported that Jay Bhattacharya may take over the National Institutes of Health, which would be a fabulous thing. He was one of the big COVID skeptics who, that I co-authored this great Barrington Declaration that said we shouldn't lock down, we shouldn't,
Yeah.
and he is great. He's from Stanford. So, but there are proposals that we need to just drastically restructure the way the federal public health bureaucracy is. The CDC has got to stop. It shouldn't be given all this power to start trying to order people to do what to do. It should focus on science instead of actually collecting data and analyzing it instead of setting public policy. And that the NIH, that all the money that's concentrated in Washington, what we should do is disperse that money to the states. So there isn't one person who controls all the research funding. And I hope in RFK, I mean, he's said some crazy things, but what I've heard him say about COVID has been almost all right. The lockdown, he recognized the lockdowns are wrong. He didn't, he said he didn't say the lab leak was a conspiracy theory. I think at first he was maybe supportive, but he came to see actually the science, as everyone called it, was wrong. And we need to do something to stop that from happening again.
I think that like with COVID, it was also tricky. It never happened before. So there was a lot of pressure for people to do, but was there corruption? Of course, I think there's a lot of corruption. But with RFK, in my opinion, then we'll go with Boris's opinion, RFK, is if you have one guy that want to explore something, that's okay. But don't put him in charge of everything if he's a kook, a little bit. Even if I think we need managers, but you can have him lead a committee to investigate, corruption in the
Right.
healthcare system, because that's his passion and been his passion forever. But remember, it's also if that's your passion for all your career, all you want to do now is prove that you're right.
Right.
You
Well,
know,
that's why you need to, I mean, you want to bring in, like for COVID, you want to bring in a commission of people to do a hard look at what worked and
yeah,
what didn't work during COVID. And the good news, I mean, Biden and Harris, I mean, Trump, he gave into the lockdowns at first, but he did recognize, that eventually, this is a mistake. But Biden and Harris, like they doubled down on the policy. They promoted Fauci. They kept, the schools stayed closed in Democratic states. And they've never said it was wrong. So I think it's great that we have someone in there now who realizes it's wrong and that Rand Paul in the Senate, he's got he's in the majority now. My biggest hope from the election was that somebody would come in and make sure that we never make this mistake with another pandemic. Because the CDC, the head of it, Biden's head of it, was saying our problem was we didn't do enough. And you go, are you kidding me? You destroyed thousands of businesses. You ruined, you just caused all this harm to tens of hundreds of millions of people, and you think you should have done more? And that, none of it worked. So at least there'll be a skeptical thing. But you're right. You don't want, RFK to just be doing his own personal whims. I mean, he's got some beliefs about, chemicals and additives that are, that are dubious, I think. But you want to have, but at least I hope that he'll bring in serious scientists to look at this and actually do it. The problem now with public health is that there is this, and we saw it in COVID, that everyone said, no, the science is this, you can't even question it. And what you want to have is, one of the proposals in the Power Bad we have is, appointing a blue ribbon commission was the traditional way to do things. But the problem, like, if Biden had appointed a blue ribbon COVID commission, it would have been all people who agreed with his policies. And one interesting idea that they do in the military, for military strategy, and they do this in some industries, like in the space industry, is you do a red team, blue team exercise. When you want to look at a subject, you get one team, the red team comes up with, or the blue team comes up with a plan and a conclusion, and then the red team's job is poke holes in that, tell us what's wrong with it. So you get dueling opinions, and that's what I'd like to see RFK do. Okay, I don't like additives. Let's come up with a plan to do something about that, and then let's have a bunch of skeptics say, no, you're wrong about this. That's too far. You're gonna do this. So.
Boris, what do you think of RFK?
I mean, I don't love him, and there's these specific segments where I agree with him, and it's unfortunate that I think almost in reaction to Trump and now in reaction to him, you have this healthy skepticism that used to exist on the left of big pharma and all these institutions that's almost compulsively now shoved by the wayside because otherwise you're not resisting Trump and otherwise you're not resisting RFK. And so I think if he's put in a position of destruction, the way you're describing, in terms of maybe dispersing more power and more money to the states, I would be happy to see that happen. But he's also a guy that historically has wanted more, and he's changed his views on this stuff. So I don't know. But I know he's a guy that historically has stepped back from wanting regulation in private industry in ways that to me seemed unreasonable. He's a guy that, even with vaccines, I've seen this evolution where, well, the problem is the mercury, even though the mercury is actually a different type of mercury than the mercury that we're talking about. Then they get rid of the mercury and he's like, well, the problem is actually this other chemical, and I just want to see them study it. And so, if the thing is to study it, that's great. I'm all for studying it. But if the thing is erring on the side of talking about how dangerous, I still don't know what the deal with seed oils is, frankly. But like, if it's just repeating that it's dangerous, I've repeated now that, like, oh, this has sunflower oil in it. And then I'm like, well, is it actually bad? How bad compared to, like, there's also no context with the way some of this stuff is framed. So yeah, I don't know. I want to be optimistic that it'll be destructive rather than adding regulations and taking away consumer choice.
Well, that's my thing, is like with him is like he's building his personality, his career on questioning certain things, that these are bad. But do you have the courage to come and say, you know what, I was wrong. Actually, it's good, So John, two questions and last this part of the conversation. But so we're talking about the power of bet. How do you
can I actually just add one thing?
Sure. Yeah, sorry.
Because this relates to the point before you mentioned about like sandwiching criticisms and things like that. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, but to me, it felt like one of the things that sort of broke during COVID when it came to like, I'm not sure if this was in terms of how it was being communicated by Fauci and NIH, or if it was how people were responding to it. But there seemed to be sort of an abandonment of putting risk into context.
Yeah.
It became this idea of like, well, you're going to kill grandmas, or it's this. And there just seemed to be nobody, no adult in the room who said, look, these risks still exist. And the same with vaccines also. I think it would have preemptively shut down a lot of the unhealthy aspects of like the anti-vax movement, to acknowledge risks, to put those risks into context and say, well, look, this is the risk of the vaccine, as far as we're aware. This is the risk of getting COVID. These are some risks that you take every day in your life when you leave the house. There's no alternative here that doesn't have risks. And something, I mean, I'm torn because it felt like that was broken, but at the same time, I also don't love the idea of like the government doing what your mom and dad should have done when they raised you, you know? But somebody needs to communicate it in a more effective way to avoid that.
No, that's absolutely. It's like when Andrew Cuomo said, if we save just one life. I mean, you can't, that's not how you make public policy to save one
Yeah, that's
life and,
crazy.
and ruin other things. And so I hope that'll come back. And one of the problems with vaccines is not something I've studied extensively, but you could see it in COVID and the critics, I think, have a point that you've got this system where they're shielded, they have immunity against, being sued for their product. And there is this, the people at NIH getting royalties from the vaccines, and there's all these incentives to develop vaccines, and there aren't the incentives. And I think RFK has said some good things about this. We have to make sure they actually report, study bad effects and report them. And then, the U.S. did a terrible job of that. I mean, to find out what was going on, some of the bad effects, they were rare, but they were severe from the COVID vaccine. It was foreign countries that were doing it, that were actually keeping track of that data, and the U.S. wasn't. So I think you need to, but exactly, you've got to do this sort of risk analysis instead of just they're all good or they're
But
all.
also with all the bad things, it was remarkable that we invented the vaccine in no time, really.
Yeah,
I
it
mean,
was.
this
Yeah,
is with everything that, because we're criticizing sometimes because that's the power of bad. Like,
right.
let's add the good in it, is like to come up with a vaccine that fast and that effective. I mean, it's amazing. We don't get enough credit for it. So last question for this one, for this part is like, so how do you criticize? What's the best way? And we said positive and negative doesn't work. What's the best way to criticize? I wish Noam is here because Noam, for this part specifically, the Comedy Cellar is one of the most successful businesses in the world. He will get one bad review and he will ruin his life.
Exactly. No, that's exactly how it is with, you go to a party and everybody's nice to you, but one person says one thing and that's you go home and
Yeah,
that's what you think
exactly.
about. And when I started writing an op-ed column at the New York Times, and I was like the libertarian on this, with this total liberal, left-wing readership. And a guy, Al Hunt, who used to write, he was like the liberal who wrote for the Wall Street Journal, and his one piece of advice, he said, "Don't read your mail."
I was
And
gonna ask you about this actually because I like people, as I said, I'm into sports and I like the people that break records. And you have
yeah.
broke a record in New York Times for the most hate mail for your recycling is garbage articles.
Yeah, no, it's so hard. I mean, and I so admire comics. I did a piece for New York Magazine about I followed a comic. This was back in the 90s, before his debut on Letterman. And he was working the clubs, and getting ready, and it was so, but I just think you're the bravest people, I mean, to be able to get up there, because I mean, you get the bad immediately, you
You
can
know
just
what's funny? There's sort of an inverse when doing a comedy set in terms of because the sandwich method works there, right? When you have a set, you want to open strong, you want to close strong, and then
uh-huh,
stuff that you're working on, you kind of sandwich in the middle and
uh-huh.
you ride the energy that it's coasting with you. So it's interesting in entertainment, and even like when putting stuff out online, the common wisdom is kind of just throw your stuff out there. All the stuff that you make that's garbage, people will forget about as soon as you have one video that really takes off that everybody loves. And that's, because the bad stuff in this context is stuff that's forgettable. It's
But
by
Yeah.
but I do feel Boris. I mean, you can correct me if for a
yeah.
comedy thing, but I think for me, from my point of view, as I think that you don't have, especially entertainment, you don't have time. Like I understand when you say like a lot of times I tell comics, if you want to do especially new ones, do the good one up front and end strong and put your new jokes in the middle. But a lot of times now with entertainment, especially when you watch videos, you don't have that luxury. People have 30 or maybe 10 seconds to watch you. The
Oh yeah.
one
For
time
live
you
comedy for sure. You're
yeah,
talking.
no, live comedy. But when you have it, like when they can't go anywhere else because they're alive. But when you're on
Right.
TV or when you're like in a Netflix special, every joke have to be boom, boom, boom. Because
Right.
if you drop one thing that's just bad, they're gonna turn the channel right away or like
Uh,
whatever. So, how do you then, John? How do you criticize people? What's the best way to do it then?
Well, I think the way, I mean, for a job applicant, as I was saying earlier, start out by saying they're not going to be fired, then give them the bad stuff, then spend a lot of time talking about their strengths and a lot of constructive stuff about here's how we're going to address that. We had a problem with this, but here's a plan and here's what we're going to do, and try and have lots of positive stuff. We're going to have another, next year is going to be good. You do this so well, we're going to exploit that strength. So, because at that point, after they've heard the bad stuff, there are interesting studies about people's attention in the brain, and they're just on high alert. Once the bad stuff comes in, they're like instantly paying attention. And you do that. And and the stuff you're talking about with comics, we talk in the Power Bat about there's interesting, research that about a good first impression is so important, and but it's harder. It takes a while to really get that good impression. A first bad impression is instant, and it's really hard to overcome. And then there's a thing too. There's been these interesting studies about people who undergo colonoscopies and how and painful procedures, and what really and the ending really matters. That if it ends in a certain that you remember that you're so influenced by that first impression, and then you're so influenced by what you remember at the very end. So those things, you guys are instinctively figure that out.
All right, let's talk about the second bestseller, which also, related to that, the willpower, rediscovering the greatest human strength. So you say that you argue that willpower is like a muscle, like you can actually build up, tune, and condition and stuff like that. I love that because I think it's so true. But can you touch on that a little bit?
Right. Well, it's like a muscle that the more you exercise it, it does get stronger, but it's like a muscle in that it gets fatigued as you use it. And, my co-author, Roy Baumeister, again, the same co-author, Roy, one of his big discoveries was they found out how people it's called ego depletion is the term. And it's how if you use up your willpower, there isn't enough left over. And his famous experiment was that these college kids would come in and they hadn't eaten, and they would sit there, and some of them would sit there in a room they hadn't eaten with these delicious freshly baked chocolate chip cookies sitting there. They could smell them. And then they would go in after sitting there for like 15 minutes or something. They would go in and do these tests of willpower. Like they test how long you can grip something and how long you can keep working at a task. And then other people were put in, and I think some of the students were told that they could eat the cookies, and others were told that they couldn't eat the cookies, but that but there were radishes for them to eat. They call that the radish condition. And the ones who had to resist the temptation to eat the chocolate chip cookies would just have less, they would perform much differently later on the task. They had less willpower. They'd used up all their willpower.
Hmm.
And that's the ego depletion. And that's been demonstrated, lots of ways and there was a famous experiment you may have heard of called the marshmallow experiment, where these kids who had to, do you want to wait to eat that if you don't eat this marshmallow, when I come back, I'll give you another one. But if you eat it, and one of the techniques that, when they watch the kids who are successful, one of the things is distract yourself. They would just think about something else, start singing, doing other things. So, and then, there's been a lot of research about self-control and willpower and who has it. And they followed people through the day, seeing what they do. And one of the interesting things they found was that people who have really good self-control, when they follow them through the day, they actually don't exercise their willpower. They structure their lives so they don't have to make decisions. They don't have to resist temptations. They don't keep ice cream in their refrigerator at home. So they don't have to use it, and they save it up. So
Oh, interesting. How
yeah.
how do you make it stronger? How do you build that willpower?
Well, just I mean, doing anything, it is like an exercise. They're just doing, getting used to doing something that requires self-control and trying to repeat that. I mean, they found there was another experiment where they just asked people to do something like do things with their left hands that they didn't usually do it, or do things that required some extra concentration. And they found that people who did that actually would have better willpower for other things if they had did these sort of exercises.
Hmm. Is addicting is the opposite of willpower? Have an addictive personality, or is it?
Well, I think some of that is genetic, people who are addicted to certain substances. And I mean, addiction is about, part of willpower is using it's again like overcoming the power of bad. It's using the rational part of your brain, the frontal cortex over and it's being able to think long term instead of immediate gratification. And addiction really, people just, they can't think long term. Food is one of the hardest things for people because in one of the ways, an effective way for quitting a lot of things is like if you quit smoking, do it cold turkey, because and it kind of you made the decision once, and then it's very clear if you're going to violate it or not. But
Hmm.
with food, you can't decide not to stop eating, So it's constant decisions. And one of the other things about, one of Roy's big discoveries was what was called decision fatigue. They found that when you make a decision, it uses up willpower, and that's why and it depletes your resource. So after a while, there was a famous study in Israel where this parole board had to decide on prisoners if they were going to release them or not, and they would find that when the prisoners um, who came in first thing in the morning had a decent chance because it takes more effort for a judge to free the prisoner. If you just keep them there, there's no risk, no one's going to.
The hungry judge phenomenon.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and one of the things I also found is that if you don't have enough glucose in your system, that actually deplete, you don't have enough willpower. So the ones who came in early had a better chance of getting parole. But then and then after a snack break or after lunch, when they got some more food, the chances went up again. But then as the day wore on, the judges were much more likely to say no. They would just avoid the decision. And that's what people do when when you get tired, you start procrastinating, and thought, well, I'm not going to make that decision. You kick the can down the road, or you start making rash decisions. You don't think it through.
It's funny because you hear a lot of times when people's like, you know what, I can't make any more decisions than today, and you think that this is just them being like annoying, but this is actually a real thing, So to tie this up again with politics, one of the, love Trump or hate him, it's, one of the things that I made, like I choose to look at people like without an agenda. It really, to me, I didn't vote for him, by the way, but
Mhm.
um for for him to be going through what he's been going through the last 4 years with, assassination attempts, a couple of them, the hate, the Russia thing, the prosecution, all this, it gives a lot of willpower to be like to stand like this and keep going and want to do it more. It's crazy to me. Not everybody have that personality.
No, I mean, Trump to me is amazing at his age doing these rallies. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, think of what that takes. I mean, it's not surprising he says really stupid stuff sometimes because
Yeah,
he's
of
just
course.
like
Yeah.
all day long going, talking. I mean, it's amazing to me somebody can do
And,
that
and
for
Joe
hours.
Rogan said he didn't use the bathroom once in 3 hours. He didn't ask for a water break or a break or anything.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing stamina, that he has, especially for his age. So I mean, that's what, and it's for most people, like during the day, like the afternoon, people, I did a piece, an excerpt of the Willpower book for the New York Times magazine called Decision Fatigue about that. And after I turned it in, the editor said to me, we decided we're never going to have meetings in the mid-afternoon anymore. We're not going to make any more decisions then because people are just not at their best at that time. So it's
Yeah, no,
usually,
absolutely. Going.
Out of
I don't have
curiosity,
Trump's stamina for talking without water.
I know that.
out of curiosity, are you familiar with any studies on marijuana and willpower?
No, tell me about them. I'd love to hear.
Oh no, I'm not. I was just curious for my own well-being. I'm like on and off, but like relatively productive when I smoke. But one thing that I noticed, because there's a lot of I feel like there's sort of a resurgence where like we went a little trigger happy with the marijuana legalization, and
Yeah.
now New York is like pretty nuts. And I've noticed personally for me, because there's a lot of debate over whether marijuana is addictive, right? And I
Right.
think that, that word kind of becomes squishy. Like you can be addicted to activities or like have unhealthy relations with things that don't necessarily have the same, chemical effect of like cocaine or whatever of rewiring your
Right.
brain. But I've noticed personally, because I've been smoking for decades, sometimes more than I should, sometimes maybe an okay amount. But I notice if I tell myself like I'm gonna take a break, right? I'm not gonna smoke any weed for a couple months. I have zero trouble. Like day one, I don't think about it at all, and I will not smoke and I'll be totally fine. But when I tell myself I'm only going to smoke like here and there once in a while, I find myself smoking more than I'd like to. It's very easy for me to do it cold turkey and not at all. But when it comes to moderating, I'm just wondering if there's maybe, if not with weed, but an analogous study in terms of willpower, why it seems harder to moderate and tell myself, I really don't need to. There's no reason not to, but I'm just not going to. Whereas it's very easy for me to just say, oh, I'm done for the next 2 months. I'm just not going to do it.
This is a
Well,
question for your dealer.
well, it's because when you do it once, then you've made the decision and there isn't anything to agonize over. But when you say I'll do it occasionally, then you're constantly. I mean, that was the thing for me with, I was a smoker and then I did, I mean, I quit a long time when I was 25. But then I would go back to nicotine gum sometimes and I did vaping. I thought vaping nicotine was amazing. You get the benefits of nicotine without without the downside. And but the thing, even then with vaping, what I didn't like was that you're constantly deciding, should I vape now or not? Am I going to do this? It's always on your mind. It's that Jones. And so it is easier to either be cold turkey or not. It's just, much simpler that way because you're not making all these decisions all the time. Do I smoke or not?
I think with both of your books, one of the main things that we want to, discuss, which you covered a little bit as well, is getting things done.
Mhm.
What is your advice for people to getting things done? Because now you know the power of bad, you recognize it, you realize it, you know how to focus, and now you know about willpower and how we can build it and how we can keep it, So how do you get things done? And you have a little story about that as well.
Right. Well, one of the, I mean, I did a novel with a parody of self-help books called God is My Broker. A monk tycoon reveals the 7.5 laws of spiritual and financial growth. And it was written with Christopher Buckley, who wrote Thank You for Smoking. And so we were parodying all these self-help books. But the one self-help book that I think is fabulous is this book, Getting Things Done by David Allen. And and he recognized a lot of the research that was going on in social psychology and he applied a lot of it. So, and part of the things in willpower, the classic ways that you achieve self-control is you have to set a goal, you have to monitor your progress toward the goal. And there are lots of little tricks you can do also to I mean, one of the interesting things that Roy Baumeister found, he did an interesting experiment where he found that these students that had an exam coming up, and he found that when they were worried about that exam, when it was in the back of their minds, he'd give them these tests where they had to read something and try to remember it. And they found that just worrying about that exam coming up would interfere with their ability to perform the task at hand. And then he found, though, that if they made a plan okay, I'm going to study for the exam Sunday afternoon in the library from 2 o'clock. Just making a plan to do something, putting it on a to-do list for a certain time, that freed their mind up and they were able to concentrate on doing that. So I think, he's got a lot of great tricks in that book, Getting Things Done. Like he has the thing called the 2-minute rule, that if there's something you have to do on your to-do list, if you can do it in less than 2 minutes, do it right now. Don't put it on a to-do list, just do it and get it out of the way. And I mean, I could talk about this interesting thing called the Zeigarnik effect. Do you want to hear about it?
Sure.
It was these psychiatrists and psychologists in Vienna were no, it was in Berlin, I think, were they went out to lunch at this restaurant, and the waiter, there were a whole bunch of them, and he took down all their orders without writing anything down, and he delivers every order perfectly, and they were amazed at his memory. So they leave lunch and somebody forgot something and then went back to the restaurant and they saw the waiter and they said, I'm looking, and the waiter just looked at them blankly. He had like no idea who they were.
Hmm.
And they said, well, you just remembered all our orders. How could you do that? He goes, as soon as I deliver the orders, it's out of my mind. And the psychologist who wrote about it is called Zeigarnik, and they call it the Zeigarnik effect, that an unfinished task lingers on your mind, and then when you finish it, it disappears, and it frees you that way. So, and David Allen knew about that. That's why he had this thing about having these lists. He has like things like tickler files, where you have a file. He would sell them, and I bought them. They were great. Where like you get an invitation to a wedding or something, you put it. You don't just leave it sitting on your desk. It goes in a file, so you've taken care of it. It's not weighing you down. I was amazed when I visited him in Ojai, California. He has a nice office there and this huge L-shaped desk, like 15 feet long. Not a single thing on it.
Oh,
Nothing cluttering his desk at all. He just kept it, there's that old rule that people have for efficiency that you should touch a piece of paper once, you should do something with it. And obviously some stuff you can't resolve, but his thing was put it away, make a plan for it, the way that experiment by where if you make a plan to deal with something, then it frees your mind.
I
So
like to do like my to-do list, and the first 5 or 6 items I've already done.
yeah. Oh, that's good.
So
Yeah.
I'd be like, okay, done, 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 done. Time for a break.
That is good. Well, there was one study I think that the typical person's to-do list for Monday, the typical executives, has more stuff on it that they could do all week.
Yeah.
There's another thing called the planning fallacy that you ask people to estimate how long it'll take them to write a paper or how long it'll take them to do a project, and they just underestimate it by so much. Everything takes longer than you think, and people just don't learn to do that. The one thing I do when I write is I try, this self-control thing. I write down when I start, and I try to set aside. There's a great rule that somebody had about writing. His thing is he would go in a room and he would just like for 3 or 4 hours, and he only had two rules, which were you don't have to write, you can't do anything else. And so he said eventually you get bored enough, you'll start writing because you're just sitting there. And so I try and do that. I set aside time, I can't do anything else. And then I try to the part of willpower about where you monitor your progress, you have to, how many words did I get done today? And I have to write that down at the end. So at least, and then and one advantage of that is when you look back at it, you can sort of see how long it took you to do things. And you can think, well, if I have an article due, I'm not going to get 1,000 words done in one day. I've almost never done that.
Hmm.
So it can make you a little more realistic in your planning. But even after all these years, I still always underestimate how long it's going to take me to do something.
I'm always curious, and then I know Boris, I have a question, and then we can go. Why is it always have so much power at the beginning of the day, the week, like on a Monday, or the beginning of the month, or the beginning of the year? Why people feel like, okay, this is a new beginning. Let me and how do you can make that every day?
Well, I think it's that people want to get things done. When they do surveys around the world and ask people, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses? By far the biggest weakness people say about themselves and the virtue they most want is willpower.
Mm.
I don't have enough willpower. I don't. So I think that, the chance that it's the start of a week or it's a new year, you think, now I'm going to get it done. I'm going to reform, because everybody thinks I didn't get enough done last year, but now's my new start. And it does feel like it's like, I mean, as a kid, I was a Catholic, and there was a great feeling that you leave confession. My sins are gone, it's a new start. And I think a new year gives you that feeling. Okay, it's going to be different this year. We also just, for a lot of people, early, it depends on people, but, being early in the day or early in the week, you have more energy.
Yeah. Boris, you have a final question?
No, less a question, more, I guess, an observation, just that I find that I have usually, like you said, more on my to-do list than I can ever get done. But I get through a good amount of it. And I've noticed, I'm sure this is probably a common observation, is that if I only have a few things, I'm much less likely to get anything done. And I have friends like that I'll sometimes collaborate with on a comedy video, let's say, and we
Uh-huh.
have different tasks that we're responsible for. And I have, maybe a set that night and a bunch of work during the day, and I have some side businesses that I run, and I'll squeeze it in between then. And then I'll have a friend who's unemployed, who's like, only thing to do that day was go to the gym, and somehow he's at the gym for 3 hours and didn't do the one thing that we said. It's just interesting how being busy is the best way to get stuff done, because I find that, yeah, when there's only one thing to do, you just keep procrastinating it and there's no sense of urgency.
Exactly. Whereas in your case, you had like, half an hour between the things you were doing and you had to do it then. And so setting a goal and a deadline is really important. It does help with that. So,
Well, for me, like I said, when I started this episode, it's very like I can relate too much to both books, and that's why I feel everybody should. It's important to read The Power of Bad and Willpower because, for me, I'm gonna share the story again. I know Boris know it, and some of the listeners know it. I was an athlete and I doing all this, and then all of a sudden I got very sick, and I needed a heart transplant, and all I heard was, the power of bad, that it's dying, the chances you're not gonna be able to get it, and I went from being an athlete to somebody in bed who cannot move, and I had to focus my mind the whole time. And anybody that knows me at that time knows that I was very positive. I always try to see the good in things. I was like, no, I'm gonna get a heart. I'm gonna live. I'm not, and I fought that for years, and I have artificial heart, and it was like, I had a wire coming out of my stomach and I couldn't move. I was disabled for a long time, and I still knew that one day things gonna be okay. And I choose to look that way. And that was the power of bad. I didn't let it get to me. I only look at the good, even though it was a little chances. And then after the first surgery and the second surgery, you know, you have to learn again how to walk, how to breathe, how to eat. You have to like a newborn child, and you have to learn everything again. And that took a lot of power. Even like eating, swallowing is very dangerous. Like you have to eat a little by little and take one step at a time. And that took a lot of willpower, a lot of, focusing on the good. And then, I did the surgery and I start walking again and start eating again. And now, I recently played again for the national team soccer in Italy for the
uh,
first World Cup ever for a transplant patient. And it just took a lot of that. But I think I would not have done it without, the willpower of that I developed from being an athlete, and also without reading your book at that time. But now I am. The power of bad is focusing on the good, and that's why I think these two things are very. I hope nothing as dramatic happened to anybody, but I'm saying in life, things gonna happen, and if you choose to look at the good stuff, you know, things gonna change dramatically, and that's why I think it's important to understand the power of bad and uh how you can rule it. So
that's great. Well, that's amazing that you've done that. As you say, it took amazing willpower on your part and being able to focus, not let those primal fears and bad stuff to overcome that with your willpower and your rational thing. And yeah, that's amazing you did that.
thank you. But I think like that's why I think it's very important the power of that. I think specifically what helped was focusing on the positive than the negative, focusing on the 1% chance versus the 99%. That's why I think like even if people need to understand how important that kind of thinking is, and that's why books like that is important. Sorry, Bert, were you saying something?
No, no, sorry, something. I got a phone call earlier that I clipped
Oh,
off.
okay. All right. Yeah, so that's great. And that's why I think you can read it and you don't need to use it. I hope you can just learn from it. John, thank you so much. It's always great to have you. I would love to have you again soon. Thank you for the
I'd
time.
be glad to
And
come back. Thank you. I had a great time talking to you guys.
if people want to find you or follow you or follow your website, buy the books, where should they go?
On X, it's John Tierney NYC. Is my handle on X. JOHNTIERNEY NYC.
All right, Boris, so people can find you. Shows coming up.
At the Boris K on X, and shows. I'll be this Saturday. I'll be at the Yard of Ale in the Poconos at 7:30. Um, That's the only one I think I'll advertise right now. And you can find my shows, all that kind of stuff at boriskhaykin.com.
There you go. And this is Live from America podcast. Guys, thank you so much, John. That was awesome. Appreciate it.
Thank you.